Hello! This is a basic watercolor techniques tutorial. I'll show how to use wet on wet to do this type of blending and wet on dry for the details like we see here. Before jumping headfirst into the papaya painting, I think it would be useful to show how watercolors work. I'll start by doing a value scale showing a range of tones going from dark to light. With other mediums, we do this by adding white paint to the original one. With watercolors, we simply keep adding more and more water. The more water we add, the lighter the color. On average, watercolor paints tend to be pretty transparent. For some colors, like light blue, light pinks and such, they tend to be mixed with a bit of white and therefore more opaque, but that is not the norm. One of my favorite things about watercolors is how the pigments tend to flow through water. I'll show this with this thing I'm doing. I did a line and then I'm using a wet brush to get it to simply leak through and create this effect. I'm drawing a circle with water to demonstrate more what I'm talking about. You will see that once I start adding paint around it, it will flow and expand through the wet area, but the side that is dry paper, it will be a very sharp line. While the paper is wet, you can take advantage of it and use the brush or gravity to move it around, move the paint around to create any effect you want. When I paint with watercolors, I think of it kind of like sculpting in a way. I'll show what I mean with another example later. But yeah, I really like how you can play with water and pigments and make them move. It's pretty magical. This is another circle, but with a dry spot in the middle. You will see once I start adding paint that it will again diffuse through the wet areas but not move towards the middle because it's dry. I would have to actually bring the paper inside that dry part for it to get paint. The paint I'm using is Winsor Blue on the green shade. The pigment is PB15 and is one of my favorite blues, by the way. Like with the other example, the paint never travels to the dry area, it just keeps expanding towards the outside. Another basic technique is glazing. With this technique, colors are applied in thin, transparent layers, one at a time. To be able to paint a large area in one go without having to reload the brush, I simply saturate my brush with a lot of the mixture. To get the color to appear as even as this, you have to sweep the brush side to side in a careful way, like I did in the demo. And now I'll show what I meant when I say that I think of painting sometimes as sculpting. I'm going to paint a sphere. It's not going to be very round, but it's a sphere nonetheless. I painted a circle using a lot of paint. As you can see, I can move it from side to side, but I cannot remove it until I dry my brush a bit. Once I do that, I can use the thirstiness of the brush to remove some of the paint, and you can see that a highlight is being made. To be able to remove or lift even more pigment, I have to actually rinse and then dry the brush. Once I do that, you can see that I'm creating some very light, almost white areas. To add more depth, I load my brush with more pigment and start adding it very carefully around the edges. Once I do that, I need to blend the edges so we don't have a sharp contrast. What I do is that I rinse and dry the brush and use the tip to difuminate that border. I continue adding pigment and blending continuously until I'm satisfied that the sphere is looking more and more tri-dimensional. And here we have a very tri-dimensional object. While the sphere dries, I'll show you what I do when I want to have a line that is not sharp. I basically lay down my paint and then clean my brush, dry it, and use the tip to difuminate that border as we're seeing here. It's very useful, especially when painting things that shouldn't have a sharp line or a visually stark line. This final exercise will show how wet and wet works when using different paints. It's a very typical exercise that you do to see how pigments interact with each other. I'm making circles with different colors that touch each other. When they do, you can see how the pigment travels in that border. When I've gone a long period of time without painting, I like to do this type of exercises as warm-up. Lately, I've been using more color markers and color pencils for sketching, so I feel a bit rusty, and this helps me gain a bit more confidence and get more in the zone while painting. Before moving on to the main tutorial, I want to show how wet on wet and wet on dry differentiate. When you paint on a wet surface, the colors just expand. There's not a sharp line anywhere to be seen. Which is not the case when you paint on an already dry surface like you see here. Like, I'm just going to add some circles and some lines and zoom in so you see what I mean. This is what makes it essential to wait for your work to be dry before adding details, if you want those details to be sharp. I don't like seeing pencil marks on my watercolor paintings. If I'm going to paint a complicated subject, I just use an H or 2H pencil. But in this case, since the papaya has a very simple shape, I just use paint to mark the contours. I mark out both the outer shape and also the inner one that contains the seeds. Once I'm happy with the shape, I just start painting the outer side of it, using a tiny bit of a warm yellow, a bit of cadmium orange, another more intense orange whose brand I don't remember what it is right now, just basically adding and mixing around some yellows and oranges. Papayas don't have a uniform color, so that's why I'm adding variations in the intensity of the orange all over the place. Now I'm going to use a mixture of yellow and sap green to mark the outer shape of the fruit. In real life, you wouldn't be able to see much of the peel, but I've noticed when I eat papayas myself that there's like a faint greenish yellow outline to the fruit, so that's what I'm trying to recreate here. I also decided to modify the shape a bit since papayas are more elongated than fully round. Now, after rinsing my brush, I'm going to use the tip to try to blend a bit the edges so there's not a stark border between the green and the yellow parts. Now I have to come in and fill out the shape since I modified it when I added the green outline. I continue adding more color with a more strong shade of orange towards the middle of the fruit. The area that contains the seeds is also orange, but is a more peach color orange, if that makes sense. The first layer is a mixture of yellow and orange, and then I use a bit of transparent orange to try to give it a different hue than the outer side of the fruit has. As an aside, you can see here about half of the palette I use the most. I have way more colors and shades and hues that the average person needs, but in my case it's truly a matter of convenience. You could probably mix a lot of these shades yourself just using a very basic palette, but I just like to sit down and paint and not worry too much about it. I just have these shades ready and I know how they work and they interact, so it just works for me, but truly, you don't need to have that many paints. Some I've bought for very specific type of uses, like for example, these light pinks tend to be more opaque than I like, but I use them a lot when I paint things like florals, skies and stuff like that, and maybe for portraits sometimes, but it's not a go-to shade. As for yellows, you truly only need one on the lemon yellow side and one kind of like cadmium yellow type, like a warmer tone. As for the oranges, they also fall in the same spectrum as a convenience purchase, because you can just do the whole red and yellow mixture. Anyway, I keep demarcating and blending to separate the core from the outer shape of the fruit, just for it to have a bigger contrast, really. I'm satisfied with how it looks now, so I'll just let it dry, and while that happens, I'll start work on the outer shape. As before, I'm just demarcating the outer shape. It's just very loose style. I'm not trying to make a twin out of the other one. I start by adding a first layer that is leaning more towards yellow than green. This is annoying when it happens, and it's typically common when you are just very energetic and your brush is just full of paint. What I try to do is use synthetic brush that is to try to clean it up a bit, but I think in this case I'll have to come back with a magic eraser to clean it up properly later. I'll just finish up filling out the shape because to me it's kind of looking a bit anemic. I like my paintings to be colorful. So yeah, I'll just do that and then clean up a bit. So I keep around small pieces of clean magic erasers that in this case I've wet and rinsed and then very carefully use to remove the traces of paint. You have to be quite careful to not ruin your paper below, and also be mindful that it has to dry if you're going to paint anything in that area and you don't want it to just spread out. Once I've added the base, I use these long movements to recreate the rich shapes the fruit has. Papayas are not fully smooth on the outside, so I'm trying to recreate that shape while giving some volume to the fruit. Now it is time to do some sculpting, so I'll use more and more dark greens to give more three-dimensionality to this fruit. To soften out some of these paint additions, I just drag my brush down, like try to smooth it out basically. It's just method I use when I want to remove some of the paint to basically lift it away. I'm using Sanders Watercolor paper that is 100% cotton. This type of paper allows you to use a lot of water, to use a lot of paint layering, moving them around, mixing. For my travel paintings, I've been using sketchbooks that the paper is cellulose, not cotton, and is on the smoother side. That doesn't really allow for this type of manipulation, at least to me. It is the type of paper that if you come in after you painted an area with a super wet brush, it will just lift what is already there. In this one, the paint is just absorbed, so you can add more and more layers without worrying that it's just going to leave the stuff that you worked so hard to put in the first place. I still really like those type of sketchbooks for fast drawings and things that have I wouldn't call a simple approach, because I don't think what I've painted there is necessarily simple, but the way you approach what you're painting has to be different. You just cannot use the same amount of water that I'm doing here. On the flip side, on the sketchbooks, I can use inks. It is easier to use Posca pens. So yeah, it's like once you start testing papers and materials, you just tend to know what is best to use according to what you want to create at the moment. It truly is just a matter of personal preference, and it depends also a lot on what your artistic style is. The first 100% cotton paper I used was Arches, which is on the pricier side. I ended up switching to the Watercolor brand due to price, but honestly, now it is my favorite if I want to use cotton paper. I just find Arches to be a bit too rough, even while using the type that is supposed to be medium grain. But yeah, at the end of the day, it's up to what each person prefers. You just have to try things, experiment, practice, and after a while you just start identifying which things work for you. In my case, I experiment a lot, not just with watercolors, but with all types of mediums. So who knows how my opinion will change on this after I keep trying new things. I think this is looking okay now, so I'll just wrap up and move on to the other side to add the seeds. I'm using a very diluted mixture of sepia brown to demarcate where the seeds are. I have some loose seeds lying around, but when you cut open a papaya, most of the seeds are clustered towards the middle. You cannot realistically paint each individual seed. What I do is simulate that there are a lot of them by playing with light and dark. The light areas are truly highlights where there is some light reflection on the seed, and the darker ones are supposed to represent those seeds that are towards the bottom that get no light. So I started with a very light mixture, and then I'll keep adding more and more pigment to keep carving out these dark areas, just to add a bit of volume to it. It's still looking a little bit flat towards the upper side, so I come in with a tiny brush once it's dry to add more and more dark details. And this is done. I normally leave these paintings to dry a bit before I remove the page and cut them up a bit to clean up, but yeah, this looks nice to me. Please leave any questions or feedback in the comment section. I'm still very new, so I need all the feedback I can get. You can also check out my watercolors guys tutorial for another simple watercolor how-to.